And for those of you watching, buy the book, Corporate Coup. It's now on sale at Amazon. You can get it through Or Books, Or Books, the publisher, if you don't want to support Jeff Bezos. But get the book, because that is the background to everything that's happening right now, particularly today, after this statement in which the U.S., Tony Blinken, has officially recognized Edmundo Gonzalez. This is a statement by the U.S. Department of State assessing the results of Venezuela's presidential election, determining before any public analysis of the data that Venezuela has stolen, or Venezuela's government led by President Nicolas Maduro, who is the candidate running for re-election, the incumbent president, stole the election, and that the U.S. recognizes his opponent, Edmundo Gonzalez, who is a stand-in for longtime coup plotter and de facto U.S.-backed opposition leader Maria Corina Machado. So, Anya, what does this statement actually mean? Does this represent a change in U.S. policy?
No, it simply represents a continuation of the failed Trump policy of recognizing a shadow corporate-led government in Venezuela. And on one hand, I'm not surprised, because so much depends on that flimsy fantasy recognition of a government that has no authority, no control over the military, no control over the ministries, no control over the borders of Venezuela. But just by existing in the minds of Washington, that shadow government provides the pretext for the continued seizure and looting of Venezuela's international assets. So one of the main cases I cover in my book is the fight over Citgo Petroleum, the largest Venezuelan asset stored abroad that is now slated to be liquidated in a U.S. court in order to pay back creditors, corporate creditors or other corporations that had a stake or claim lodged against the the Venezuelan government. And the only way that this litigation can go forward is if the status quo remains in place. This fake government is given authority over the Venezuelan state in the eyes of U.S. courts. If the U.S. had reversed its recognition of a shadow government in Venezuela, then suddenly those cases would become far more complicated, because the actual elected and internationally recognized Venezuelan government led by Maduro would have an authority in U.S. courts once again. So it's all of this. All of the fighting over who's actually in charge of the government really is just a cover for the continued looting and theft of Venezuela's wealth. So it doesn't surprise me on one hand that the U.S. doubled down on the policy. On the other hand, it seems ridiculous at this point to continue recognizing a government that has no legitimate authority. It obviously jeopardizes the status of Venezuelan migrants in the country, because they still don't have an embassy here that can properly give them services. And it hinders the ability of the U.S. government to just directly negotiate with the actual real government in Caracas, whether that's in terms of trade or other areas of commerce. So how long can this charade continue? I'm not sure. I think they would at least like it to go until Citgo is fully liquidated. But on the other hand, there's that gold sitting in the Bank of England, and I think London would like it to be there indefinitely. So I don't know what it will take actually for the U.S. and its allies to reverse this ridiculous policy. I mean, it doesn't matter, again, who wins elections or whether or not the elections were fair. The U.S. was going to go forward with this no matter what.
Yeah. I mean, so Edmundo Gonzalez steps in for Juan Guaido, who's now like a professor at some, Florida International University. I've heard him speak English, and, he's not very articulate. I don't know how he got through George Washington University, but the point is, when no one knew who Juan Guaido was before he was appointed president. and no one knew who Edmundo Gonzalez was. And you see Edmundo Gonzalez on camera. He doesn't seem to know where he is. He's very much like Joe Biden. He has trouble standing up at his own rallies. He's sort of disappeared. But the background on Edmundo Gonzalez and how he found his way into this place is really interesting and highlights the agenda of the U.S. as he becomes the new Guaido. This is a Salvadoran priest who is talking about Edmundo Gonzalez's role. I'm not going to play the video in the 1980s in El Salvador. And this Twitter user is referring to Edmundo Gonzalez as El Matacuras and saying he was aligned with the American interests in El Salvador in the 1980s. And he helped the death squads who were responsible for killing social activists and 6 Jesuit priests, including Monsignor Oscar Romero, who was the archbishop who was shot in the chest by a death squad leader because he was opposed to the military junta and calling for a ceasefire. So who was Edmundo Gonzalez? Who is Maria Corina Machado briefly? And how are they, how is this figure, how did this figure sort of wind up where he is that no one had heard of?
I'm willing to bet that it's still the same American figure that was coordinating with Edmundo Gonzalez back in the 1980s that's running U.S. policy right now in Venezuela, and that's Elliot Abrams. Elliot Abrams was overseeing the U.S.-backed dirty war in Central America throughout the 1980s at a time when Venezuela was, yes, allied with the U.S. in that extremely bloody and horrific battle. And Edmundo Gonzalez was working, as we just heard, in El Salvador at this time. And Elliot Abrams would go on to be convicted for lying to Congress over his role in Iran-Contra and get pardoned and wind up back in the Bush administration, the Bush II administration, in the National Security Cabinet of George W. Bush at the time when the U.S. backed another coup in Venezuela in 2002 that temporarily removed Chavez from office. It was reported in The Guardian that Elliot Abrams was the driving force behind the coup at that time. And we can only assume when Maria Corina Machado was welcomed in the Oval Office just a few years later in 2005, that Elliot Abrams was among the cast of characters in Washington that she got to know. And that was also around the time when USAID selected Maria Corina and her organization Sumate to receive funding, U.S. State Department funding, because it was identified as one of the most effective grassroots, so-called grassroots organizations opposing Chavismo. And so Maria Corina Machado had this financial relationship with the United States since basically the inception of Chavismo, since the early 2000s. And Elliot Abrams has been there every step of the way as well, not only in the Bush administration, but then working as Trump's Venezuela envoy, and is still in the Biden administration advising on Latin America policy. So the fact that they put a figure like Edmundo Gonzalez, who, as you say, is a lot like Biden, can barely speak and walk and doesn't really seem to know what's going on, suggests that, yes, there are bigger forces behind him running the show, just like with Biden. And it's not hard, once you look at his background, to identify who those figures could possibly be.
So the coup continues with different faces, but the same agenda. Here's someone frankly acknowledging that it was a coup.
I don't know that I agree with you, to be fair, with all due respect. One doesn't have to be brilliant to attempt a coup.
I disagree with that. As somebody who has helped plan coup d'etat, not here, but other places, it takes a lot of work, and that's not what he did.
When we were talking about what is capable, what you need to do to be able to plan a coup, and you cited your expertise having planned coups.
I'm not going to get into the specifics, but
successful coups?
Well, I wrote about Venezuela in the book, and it turned out not to be successful. Not that we had all that much to do with it, but I saw what it took for an opposition to try and overturn an illegally elected president.
I don't know that I.
It's all fun and games. They're sitting right there in the Capitol Rotunda where the quote unquote insurrection took place and joking about planning coups abroad. John Bolton is a major figure in your book, Corporate Coup. John Bolton is someone that Nicolas Maduro, in my interview with him in Caracas, held personally responsible for attempting to assassinate him with drones in 2018, a plot that emanated from Colombia. Are we witnessing a coup again? I mean, it's supposed to be a presidential election. And what are your thoughts on the election where it stands now? Is there any validity to this claim that the election was stolen?
Well, as I've explained many times, the Venezuelan election, the actual process, voting process, is very easy to audit because of the fact that you have to present a physical ID, scan your fingerprint, and that there's actually a physical receipt printed off the electronic vote that you make. And that physical tally is automatically audited against the electronic vote. The electronic voting machines are not connected to the internet, unlike in the United States. So there's not a lot of room for fraud. And the issue is here, according to Venezuela's constitution, they don't have the central election, the National Election Council doesn't have to publish the local polling data the night of the election. And because that didn't happen this time around, the next day, within hours, actually, really, Maria Corina Machado and the opposition came out with their claims of fraud in their own data that they presented online, which then the New York Times and mainstream corporate international media ran with. And institutions like the Carter Center, which in the past had been supportive and had praised Venezuela's election system, came out and were criticizing the government and asking for this local polling data. And so as the violence that we saw kind of kick off at the beginning of the week, intensified, you had people shooting at National Guard troops and soldiers. It looked like the Guarimba riots that had broken out in Venezuela over the last, really since Maduro won his first election in 2014 or 13. Since those riots began, like every time there's an election, the opposition comes out and says that unless they win, they're pretty much going to hold the political system hostage. And that's what they began. That's the process they began earlier this week, shutting down roads. And this time around, it looks like that was all put to bed pretty quickly. The government made mass arrests, pretty much said that a lot of these people in the streets weren't even political. They were just violent criminal gangs that had been paid out to create chaos. And from what I've heard in Venezuela now, the streets are calm, streets have reopened, or stores have reopened, and there's not really a fear that those riots are going to get as intense as they were in previous years. And since the election and since Machado and the opposition came out with all of their data, Maduro came out with his own response, which is to call on all of the political parties who participated in the Sunday election to submit their independent data to the Supreme Court. And that's because, as part of this process that I described with the audit and the counting of the votes, every party sends officials that are present for the vote tally to, observe it and collect data and have their own internal party data. And so because the opposition got out there ahead of the National Electoral Council with their data, Maduro's solution is to say, well, now his party and other opposition or supportive coalition parties are going to submit their numbers to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is going to hold an independent audit of the election. So things are kind of on hold. It's my feeling that Maduro will weather this storm just as he has all of the others that have been thrown at him over the last decade. And I would assume that Maria Corina Machado will either be in jail or Miami or Madrid by the end of the year or within a few weeks, if not days.
Yeah, it really seems like all that the opposition has at this point is a media war, which it's waging through U.S. media and through private media across Latin America.